Welcome to Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast series about communication skills in the workplace. I'm your host, John Witzman. Join me as I speak with industry professionals and Conestoga faculty and alumni to explore their journeys with reading and writing skills. Follow us as we talk about how communications learning has changed over the years, how these skills are used in a wide range of industries, and the future of workplace communications. I am here with Alan Lotaquan from Conestoga College's Media Services Department. Hi, Alan. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. It's good to have you here. So I want to talk to you about academic reading and writing skills, and we're going to cover a lot of ground today, but I want to jump right into the heart of the matter and ask you to go back when you were in school and you had a communications course on your timetable and you saw that you were going to do academic reading and writing in your post-secondary education. How did you feel? What was your reaction when you saw that was a course on your timetable?
I guess, I always have loved obviously reading and writing and just media itself, right? Just, books and things like that, pop culture and, coming from the thing is I should probably preface it a little bit with, I went to an art school, an art college.
Oh, I didn't know
right?
that.
Yeah. So I went to Sheridan.
Okay.
So that I had that's my background there. So, we didn't do as much as, that's why I was a little bit worried when you kind of had me on the, maybe on a technical level, right? But I thought maybe I could represent that demographic, and maybe even going back further in who I am, being a minority and first generation Laotian here. So I don't know if you know, about the background of Vietnam War and all that. So
Sure.
So from that, my parents, they were refugees in Thailand, and then they came here.
So you weren't born in Canada?
I was born, so
Okay.
I'm first generation here,
Okay.
but no one spoke English, right?
In the home?
In the home. So I was kind of the first to kind of lead the way, and then, I have a sister and cousins later on, but, so I went through that whole experience with ESL and everything else because as much as I loved it, I always felt challenged, right? Just because I didn't have that support at home, let's say, right? And, so I found that really difficult. I felt a bit slow even, so that, it was really challenging on that front. So, and growing up, I think it's always been a challenge being in that kind of, ethnic kind of household, right? So I had to kind of find my own way and learn to kind of read on my own and get it, and picking up things like Lord of the Rings and
Sure.
things like that, and kind of nerding out with friends and things like that. That really helped me kind of build that, an understanding of that. So.
Is that where you went for your source material as a young person, was popular culture?
I did, yeah. It obviously started with games and comics, so I definitely grew up, with Marvel and DC and all that, and reading a bunch of comics and playing, games. So yeah, I was born in '81, so I grew up in that, playing Super Nintendo
Sure.
and Nintendo, obviously,
Yeah.
So, things like that kind of led me into other things, right? And I had obviously, so there's a whole other culture too. So I grew up with my older cousins, are the ones that introduced me more into music and
Right.
things like that. And it's actually interesting too. I know this is a bit of a tangent,
Sure.
but just to kind of give a background of who I am, I guess I figured it might be important to paint a little bit of that picture, right? So, I grew up in Toronto and then in Jane and Finch particularly, and so my cousins then were, back then it was hip hop, everyone listened to back then it was being introduced to it because you kind of grow up just past that age, right? So when you're 10, you're hearing Run DMC and
Yeah.
KRS-One and
Yeah.
and those guys and LL Cool J and all that, right? And so then after that, when I actually moved from there to Brampton when I was about 13
Okay.
or so, and then I was kind of the only minority in the entire school. So then I was and my dad is, I don't know how far we're going to go into tangents, but my dad, he escaped poverty and war and everything, right? So, he came in and I was in a public school up until then, and then he thought, a priest had taken him in before the communists came in and kicked him out of the country.
Wow.
So he told me that, he'd like me to go to Catholic school. So I actually went to Catholic school afterwards. And, obviously the culture there kind of molded me too. So I got introduced to like classic rock and like alternative and so on and so on. So it was kind of like an interesting social melting pot of things, right? When I look back, I was like, that's a unique experience and unique perspective because of that, right? So, but yeah, that kind of pulls me back into everything else and how retreating to books and entertainment and things like that, kind of leading me into really story and just understanding where we come from and things like that. So that kind of got me really interested. And then.
Did you get the sense when you were at school that there was a formal language, that there was a version of English that was official or over there, and that it was different from the style of communication or the words even that you were using with your friends and using at home? Did you feel like there was a divide there?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, obviously with like slang and even with my background, I was when I was in Toronto, there was a lot more diversity and things like that. So culturally, I was exposed to different ethnicities and that kind of affects communications, right?
Sure.
For sure.
Was it a struggle to transition between those different modes of communication? Did you find that it was more comfortable in one or the other?
Yeah, it's kind of like when you grow up like the ugly duckling. There's a phase where it doesn't translate so well at first. Because you when you're kind of going from one environment to the next, obviously language and communication is it's a bit of a hurdle to kind of understand, sure. Right? And how to articulate and find the words and vocabulary and things like that. And so I always kind of looked down on, I was kind of looked down on after, and you have to kind of adjust. Like obviously the way I speak in a formal setting versus an informal setting, right. I've had to learn those skills, right? And I've been kind of thrown into the fire. So you kind of have to learn on your feet, right? With that there, and so.
Do you have a recollection of an awkward moment where you felt like you said the wrong thing in a presentation or to the teacher?
Oh, a few things. It might be too embarrassing to share, but absolutely, I think it's just understanding the. Even later on, I think I remember I was in college and I didn't understand pro bono.
Oh yes, yeah, that would be.
And I I was like pro and bono. Like I just didn't understand the word.
The singer from U2.
Exactly, I knew Bono.
Am I for him
exactly.
or against him?
Yeah, exactly. And I remember because I went to an art college, so that had come up, and someone had asked a question, and I didn't understand at all. Right, so it's just little things like that where. Yeah. I think it's helped, like, reading and things like that has helped kind of bridge that for sure. And obviously in high school, you go through the typical books and things like that, I do remember like Lord of the Flies and all that, whatever,
sure.
Right? The reading materials that you kind of grow up with. And so it definitely helped. But I think for me, a lot of it, what I've learned is kind of like the verbal skills, right?
Okay.
And obviously being I worked at CTV News for almost like 8 years. Afterwards, and like even when I was in college, there was writing a bit.
Tell me more about writing in college. I'd love to know, what were the courses like when you were at Sheridan? Does anything stand out in terms of the types of assignments that you were being asked to do, or the types of things that you were being asked to read? Did you have a textbook?
Nothing as because it's a college, it's applied. It's a lot of it's all art. It's a lot of illustration and things like that. I think there was, if I recall, there was like writing for like story and things like that.
So no
right?
5-paragraph essay for you.
No. We kind of lost. That was kind of like a way by like high school kind of thing.
Okay.
We didn't have to get into all of that. So that's why, like, again, I bring it back to, you're sure, John, if you want to, have me as your first guest in that regard. But like I said, if I could represent that spectrum, maybe it still serves its purpose here, right? But
absolutely. When you were in college and you were taking these courses that were asking you to write maybe a little bit more creatively or narrative, did you ever feel like you were drawing on the previous education? Did you feel like when you went to that toolbox in order to write an idea, to communicate an idea, that, I have this tool that I had developed from the previous lesson? Or did you feel like you were sort of developing a new bag of tricks?
I think both,
Yeah.
right? Just to kind of fill in the gaps. Not having as much support early on, you kind of have to kind of fill in the gaps a bit. And then when I was in college, I continued reading and things like that on my own and kind of like learning on my own in that regard. But when it came to the creative writing, it wasn't as technical. It's an art college, right?
Yeah.
So
even the instruction in your other courses was more hands-on. You didn't get like a textbook in your illustration class so much as there was a lesson and it was more back and forth with your instructor?
it's been years.
Okay.
And so I apologize, John. It's been like 20 years.
I know. It's good to
right?
go back and dig up these college memories
yeah.
now that we're in our middle ages.
Yeah. And, so it's one of those things. So it's hard to recall.
Sure. Was there pressure? Did you feel pressure to master this skill set because of your parents' backgrounds and their experience being new to a culture and new to a language? Did you feel like that was a sort of an extra hurdle that you had to jump over in order to be sort of competitive in that landscape?
Definitely. Yeah. There was always that pressure, right? And then there's also, you got to, bring it home to kind of teach the parents. So my parents did speak English, broken English and all that. But that was definitely the pressure was there to do that. And like I said, the technical stuff that I learned from, let's say, high school and things like that still kind of carried forth and definitely helped me, later on, right? And I do currently, I do creative writing and things like that for fun. And so I'm definitely interested in that world and obviously, working with journalists and those years. And
I want to talk
college.
more about that. You said you worked at CTV News for several years. What did
CKCO.
What did you do there?
I worked there. So they had 3 shows. They had Province-Wide, The Beat, and obviously the news, like CTV News. So I was kind of like the one person that did all the graphics and for them, so all the motion graphics and things like that. But I had the privilege every morning to sit with all the like a round table with journalists pitching ideas and things like that. So they pitched ideas and I worked with many different types of I guess many journalists have come through. So I've had to kind of adapt to their kind of like the way they communicate and the way they work and things like that. And obviously you pick up things too when you're working in there, like, speak so you're not misunderstood, like leaving things for less interpretation. And they'll distill their ideas into like 3-4 words kind of things like that when they're pitching, right?
Right. I imagine that would have been an environment where you need to be concise and clear because people are moving quickly and there's not a lot of time. We got to get out into the field. So brevity and precision is key in that situation. Was that something that you found yourself getting better at over time? Were you noticing things that other people were doing and you were picking up little tricks in terms of how they pitched their idea in a way that really hit?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously there's a bit of vetting on my end, so when things are coming through, but absolutely, you can't help but like kind of pay attention, right? And absorb just the wealth of knowledge and how they think and how lean. It's you pick up these phrases like if I had more time, I'd write less and things like that, right? And just what it takes to kind of lean out content and how to speak to it efficiently. So you definitely have to acquire those skills when you're working with journalists, right? So there's you can't leave much to interpretation. There's no subjective. You can't kind of live in that world, right? We have to be very. So definitely, in those seven years, I've had to learn that and kind of. And it's benefited me. And now I'm at the college here, and it's benefited me tremendously. I used to be quite quiet, and now people, it's kind of strikes me when people are like, "Oh, you're always outspoken, and you seem pretty, social and extroverted." And I wasn't like that up till maybe 25, maybe. I was pretty quiet to myself, and a lot of that maybe had to do with the insecurities of like the language and so on and the education in that regard. But later on, I kind of just learned to embrace that, and I think it comes with it builds confidence, right? I still,
Sure.
you have I think that's the point of kind of like developing that skill. You know how to kind of cater it to your audience and reading a room and and when you're speaking with friends versus speaking in a formal setting, right? So. To be able to switch those and go between them is very important.
I think you're so right about the confidence that comes from having your words express your ideas, right? Having a clear path for what you want to say or what you're feeling come out the way that you want it to, and how much time and practice it takes to build those pathways so that they're clear and that they actually allow those ideas to flow through into words. And when you brought up the idea of confidence, it brought me back to that morning meeting at CTV, because I really can picture that scene as being a kind of high stakes environment, right, where people are coming to not quite the battleground, but there is sort of an arena where the best idea is going to win the day. And so I love the idea of you as a the relative junior in the room, and you've got to keep up, and you've got to get the job done and prove yourself. And one of the questions that I have when I'm picturing that scene is, are you taking notes? Do you have a notepad in front of you with a pen in your hand?
Yes, always.
Okay, so I want to, if I can, just spend a few minutes talking about note taking, because this is a particular interest of mine. I see note taking changing. I see people using their laptops or tablets or their phones to take notes, and I'm very curious about what that looks like compared to how I take notes. And I can look at my notepad in front of me right now and know that there's some comfort there for me and probably nothing coherent or intelligible to another person. And I think that's really interesting because it's so different from what we are doing in a formal communications educational environment, where the whole point is to communicate clearly to anybody who might read it. So when you're taking notes, did you have a shorthand? Do you remember sort of developing a little style over time? Do you remember what it was like going back to look at your notes later? What do you remember about that moment where you're sitting there and the ideas are flying around and you're trying to capture it?
Yeah. Definitely. You're looking for buzzwords, it triggers kind of like your ideas and things like that. Absolutely. And as I'm hearing the different ideas, and because I'm obviously I'm there to kind of think visually, right? And it's great because I'm a visual learner, and that's currently what I'm doing in my current role. So, I'm always kind of like in my head, and I'm trying to interpret that. So I'm hearing things, I'm writing down ideas quickly, and it moves fast, like you said. So I'm trying to pool resources together and things like that to help express that idea, right? Because the thing with communication and the way I see it in that role was to, like, how do you digest the information, right? And a picture's worth 1,000 words, and so on and so on. So how do you use that to, and folks at home that are watching, whether the shows are news or, you're kind of having lunch or dinner or whatever, and so it's just a way to kind of visually give you the visual cues and things like that, and definitely with complex ideas and things like that too. So how do you kind of,
what does your page look like? Are you creating little boxes? Are you breaking down the page into little sections?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm like circling things. I think I had like a red and black, and so I'll underline. And
you're underlining.
Absolutely. So all those, taking little notes.
You have arrows connecting ideas.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's fun. It's one of those, like, I do recall, like, after the meetings, I'd have to go and unpack it quickly, right? Because, as ideas are flying and your notes kind of get a little messy, you develop tactics to kind of to manage that, and then you have to go and unpack that later on. So
Right.
I'll kind of make another note to refine that later on. So right after that meet.
How quickly after do you have to go before those ideas start to go stale?
Yeah, it's happened a couple of times where you're trying to just you're kind of forgetting like bits and pieces here and there, and I might go and have a conversation with a journalist or and ask them just to kind of trigger some of the thoughts, just to get me back down that pathway of thinking. Because sometimes you don't have time to finish a thought, right? Because things are moving. So you kind of lay the pathways down in the notes. So that's how I saw it, as to kind of trigger, that's worthy of contemplation later on. So I'll make a note and then later on reflect on that.
I love that image of laying the pathways, that you're sort of connecting dots, that this is something structural, that there's something tangible about ideas, and that the words, and not just the actual words or even fully formed sentences, but the way that those can be connected in creative ways, in ways that are sort of unique to you. We talk about these things in classrooms all the time when we talk about mind maps or brainstorms, flow charts, right? We try to create various kinds of visual representations for ideas to help people develop their ideas, plan their ideas. And it's challenging. It's a hard thing to learn. It's a hard thing to teach. And so I'm curious to know from somebody who sounds like uses these techniques and maybe sort of developed these techniques almost naturally. Do you think that this style of thinking and thinking on the page and connecting ideas, do you think that it's something that can be taught in a linear way, right? Use this technique, connect these dots this way. I mean, what is that? Could you imagine what you do to map out ideas? Could you imagine trying to teach someone else to do it that way?
There is, I guess, like a foundation of how to kind of think about that. And
what would some of those foundational elements be for you if you were given an associate, right, a new hire, and you were told, hey, take this person under your wing, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that you thought, okay, this person needs to be able to record ideas in a discussion, what would be some of those fundamental elements that you would teach them first as their baseline?
I guess, but I had mentioned the kind of like the buzzwords, the pathways, right? Like
capture key ideas.
Yeah, and it's also kind of like knowing how your own mind and how you think too, right? There's a bit of that too. So understanding how to distill that into these trigger words, and laying those pathways, so then you can recall that, right? That information. There's a lot of, I find that it's very similar. Like my artistic background, I've done like painting and sculpting and things like that. Like the thing that I find that's, at least for me, that translates is, like when you're kind of sculpting something and you're getting the vague shape of it, and then you're going in to get the rest of it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And you're kind of taking it away. So it's kind of, you're kind of going in all directions, I find sometimes too, right? Like you have the scaffolding and the foundation, but then you have to find ways that works for you as well, right? There's like, and later on in life, like kind of learning like the art of studying and the art of like all of that is on its own, very important to kind of develop, and understand. So those are things I learned later, right? And so I would say to kind of, for anyone that starts in that, just to, it's just a lot of stuff, doing the courses with you with the communications there, like the active listening and all those things. I definitely had to learn them. A lot of my learning was in the industry, right? Working with peers and things like that. And especially in the college now, working with yourself. And obviously, there's a reason for all of it, right? Like, you have this technical foundation, and seeing it being practiced, let's say, in use, and seeing the benefits of that, how to articulate and coming up with ideas and how to think of that. You could see where that's, I kind of had to live in that, right? So it's built a lot of the foundation and my natural instincts in that regard, I think. So I always approach that. So each time I meet a new faculty, for instance, like gauging that, and then, and just having a general interest in the courses too as well, and understanding how it's communicated. And I think you and I, when we're kind of doing that, you're going from the classroom to doing an animation or a video. It's, two different things sometimes, right? Like you're using, like certain things like repetition and things like that. It's like the picture's worth 1,000 words, right?
Sure.
So you can teach it visually. You can condense and distill complex ideas down visually, right? So
Alan, you and I have worked together on a couple projects with exactly what you're saying as the foundation, where I've come to you as the professor for communications course, COM 1085, and we've asked you and your team to help us illustrate concepts that are oftentimes kind of abstract, right? Kind of theoretical. Concepts like purpose and audience, or elements of sentence structure or paragraph structure, how to conduct academic research. And you and your team have guided us through the process of sort of developing the ideas that would allow us to visualize some of these things, and then you've actually created these visuals to produce really outstanding illustrated videos. Is that the core of what you do now at the college? Is that relationship, working with faculty throughout the college to bring their sort of course content to a visual medium?
Yes, absolutely. And there's a lot of sensitive subject matter. We work with PSW and long-term care and things like that, and we're dealing with illnesses, and how do we show that respectfully, right? And communication it's everything in those circumstances, right? Like, it's the verbal. It's like picking up on the concerns of the faculty and seeing how it translates, right? But that's where my job comes into, because I'm all visual, right? So to kind of to bring that in a way, or to try to condense what you're saying, into visuals that can aid in it, so it's not the heavy lifting of, to overwrite or explain, the visual can really demonstrate that, efficiently.
Can you think of an example or an incident, a story from your current day-to-day life in this media services role, illustrating, animating, where you could point to a situation that would perhaps challenge the belief of a student who is in illustration right now, who's in animation right now, and they're taking a communications course as part of their program, and they're thinking, I don't need this. I don't see how this fits into my career. I'm going to be illustrating. I'm going to be working with various visual production tools. What would be an example or a workplace situation where you could say, actually?
Yeah, I know, that's a great question. I think it's so important. I think that's the wrong mindset to think it has nothing to do. It's all communication, really. So how to articulate your thoughts and ideas and things like that, and distill them as a creative, as an illustrator, animator. Like I said, it's really transferable. It's very familiar. It's universal. Some of these things, and all the things in your courses that I've observed, they definitely play such a big role in that, right? Like I've written some short stories. I actually have an animation up that I did up on my website, and and it's like a Western, and it has a you know what I mean.
Oh, cool! I want to read that.
Yeah. You could. It's actually animated, right? So
oh, wow!
I got like a tablet, and I thought I'm going to try to animate this whole thing on a tablet, right? And it's like a Western and all this. I'll kind of let you watch it, and won't spoil it there. But I just wanted to get some dialogue, have a kind of like beginning, middle, end, and see how to write that, and and that whole structure of that, how to distill that.
That was the word that jumped out at me when you've been talking about this and throughout your recollection of how you use these communication skills in the workplace, that your ability to organize these ideas is something that you find really useful to create a structure, something that you can go back to and stand on when you need these ideas, when you need to move forward, that they're not just falling through the sky and disappearing, that they're substantial.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's universal things in graphic design there's even in art, there's always like things like hierarchy, right?
Right.
It's very important for design.
Sure.
If you think about hierarchy and your thoughts and ideas and how you lay like the pathways, right?
Yep.
You kind of might set them up as a hierarchy, so they I've always seen the parallels of that, and I always thought it was interesting, we look back, like everything's in art, right?
Sure.
And, the Japanese kind of like think of it that way. They romanticize it even. And I think it's a great way of looking at it because it's so universal in the way we think about that, right? And with writing, there is these, tactics and strategies to and like building that foundation. I think you and I have talked about that. Like you have to know the rules in order to break them and things like that. So there's these little things that you pick up along the way, and you might kind of like understand. Like you might understand them for face value, but in practice, and constant practice, you get better and you develop an intuition, right? And that's what served me a lot through the years working, and especially now in the roles with yourself.
Can you think of any people that you worked with along the way? And of course, I don't want you to name any names, but have you seen colleagues who have struggled with that aspect of their graphic design career? Can you recall some people who had those hard skills of graphic design, but maybe struggled in that element of communication, whether sort of in meetings or in emails or in their ability to condense ideas or understand the brief that was being given to them? Is that something you've seen along the way, that people maybe had the one area that they were getting in explicit instruction in, but this other area they were weak in, and that hurt them? Is that something that you can actually recall seeing, or maybe you wouldn't have been as aware of it happening?
There's a couple of examples that I was trying to kind of run through my head, and just like through communication, obviously it's so important to articulate the ideas, and I've definitely been in meetings and things like that had where that kind of starts to fall apart, and I think there's many other aspects to it,
right.
Having different data points and understanding, before you kind of make those decisions, or being hung up on certain ideas. There's that, I think Aristotle said, it's like an educated mind is a mind that could practice thought without believing in it. So it's like being able to kind of throw away ideas and move it and not be committing to that, like to commit too early on certain things.
Sure, I like that.
And I think it kind of, for me at least, I think it stifles that creativity. You have to be kind of loose, like that clay thing I was telling you with the, and understanding that, and not try to stand on solid ground too early, right, and make those commitments. So when it comes back to the communication part of that, I think that's I guess, I don't know if it speaks deeper to the person.
No, it does. I think you're right. I think that it's probably a window into the depth and range of their ability outside of what they've explicitly been trained to do. And would you say that what was the transition from training to workplace like for you? Did you find that there was a sort of extra dimension that wasn't part of the explicit training that you had to sort of figure out on the fly?
Like
A real life dimension that could only be really appreciated once you're in the role, or did you feel like more or less, your training and education mapped pretty closely on to the kinds of things that you were doing in the workplace?
I guess I could speak to an earlier question too, of like coming from that place, that thinking maybe I don't need like writing or communication skills because I'm an artist.
Sure.
Like maybe I'm guilty of that early on too, because everyone's young at some point, and
but then you memorized some Aristotle and you were ready to go. Did you have that all ready to go, or did you prep that one?
No, it's just something that's always stuck with me. You
That's
you
great.
have those little phrases and things like that stick with you,
Sure.
as you're trying to build the pillars to your temple, as that's what I call it.
Yeah, I like that.
You're always trying to, you get these revelations and things like that, right? So, and like it takes a lot of life experience and things that you go through, and then after that, those kind of phrases have meaning, right? As you're trying to explain it, and someone has articulated it better than you have, it really kind of sticks with you,
Totally.
So yeah, it's sorry, what was the question?
Actually, I love that idea of the pillars of your temple. This idea of foundation and structure is something that we've come around to a lot in talking about communication skills broadly. The idea that the ability to pull meaning out of a text in a way that is sort of capturing those main ideas. The ability to record those ideas in a way that is concise and efficient, but also accurate, and that is something kind of fundamental to being a thinking productive professional, certainly a creative professional, and being your kind of part of your foundation, the pillars of your temple. And so it's a kind of perfect way for us to transition into the last thing that I want to talk to you about is the future. And do you see that temple that you've constructed holding up in the future? Do you see a storm on the horizon, or the sky's clear? What does the future of your field, graphic design, illustration, what does that look like for you in a post-COVID workplace world where we're working more remotely with artificial intelligence, DALL-E, ChatGPT? What do all of those tools on the landscape mean for you in your work, and how do you think that might change the way that you communicate ideas?
It's such a game changer, right? Like there's so many things that we can't even fathom, like that will change every industry. I think I was listening to it was like a podcast or something about like the fact that this next revolution, it's not even the industrial age. This is like the wheel,
right?
Like this is going to change everything in every facet of our life, and so. For me, when I look at them, so I kind of did hesitate for a while getting into these apps and looking at generating art and animations and things like that, and just because you kind of want to get your head kind of in order before you kind of jump in and understand it all, because it's such a. Who would have thought this would be here this early, right? Like you have Jay-Z rapping like a Nas song. The Biggie Smalls is rapping, you know what I mean? It's like this, and you could have Tupac for the end of days. We having him rap, just write lyrics that can generate, and we can have music from deceased artists. This is the reality, right? So it's like, what does this all mean? When I look at it through communications, that lens of what does it mean for us? I think human connection is going to be more important. We're already feeling that now. So, we can't let that take the place of, let's say, how we articulate and our ideas and how we converse. I think maybe it could be a renaissance of like art and poetry and things like that. I mean, this is the optimist.
Right. This is us rebelling against the machines.
Exactly.
Is
right.
a humanist movement where we do the one thing that the machines can't. and that is think and feel and communicate and share ideas. I like that. That's certainly the optimist side of me likes that idea. Going back one step, do you remember, or do you have a sense of a change happening over the last couple of years, maybe even before COVID or maybe during COVID, as new technologies started to enter the culture, whether it's the popular culture or specifically the workplace? Can you recall, sense that the way you communicated with your colleagues and they communicated with you, did that start to change when texting and social media communications became more common? Do you remember the emails getting shorter and then the emails becoming chats?
I resisted it early on. I actually would tell my friends to call me.
Okay.
And I wouldn't reply to their texts, right? It's one of those. Even in the beginning of COVID, I didn't want to Zoom much. I'd rather, it's like, oh, this is exhausting. And then I realized I have to embrace this. This is the only way I can get some kind of connection.
Yeah.
So there was always a resistance to it. And, and now, so definitely, right? Like, I like the one-on-one. I like the body language. I've acquired these skills now because I've worked in these fields, and I've come to love my interactions with people and things like that. And I do feel like we need more and more of that. Like if people are feeling that void in their lives too, and I think it's definitely difficult. It's made things more difficult. It's made this generation the loneliest generation. I believe that, right? Like you need to have that substance, you need to interact, you need to have the verbal skills, right? If you can curate everything through texting and think about your words, and then you have to have your the way you speak in person. What can you retreat to? Are we? You're thinking about these things. You're more likely to lock up because you can't self-edit in your head. You need to develop these mechanisms and practice it, right? Like I found my communication got much worse when during COVID. I was just bumbling around.
I felt that way too.
Exactly, right? I've tried to be conscientious of like the words I use, saying, retreating to ums and likes and this and that a lot. I noticed I was doing that a lot more. So it's things like that you're trying to. I'm always working at it, and that's what I learned from news. You're always working at that, like obviously, right? So being mindful of that constantly, and that growth. I think learning it early on and embracing it early on, it would have helped me get into this space much sooner, right? Obviously it's trial by fire and things like that. How to like I said, you kind of have to learn messily, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in school, you can be prepared for those situations if you embrace it now. So I think definitely it's going to always be important, and the one-on-one, people to people, we always need to improve that, right? We need to find ways to maximize. I think there'll be industries that are revolving around that. So, I think it's interesting.
I love that idea of one-to-one being part of the written communication process, and being somehow different from a one-to-many communication process. So if I'm posting on a social media platform and I don't necessarily have a specific audience in mind, does that make me feel connected in the same way as it would if I was in an email exchange back and forth with somebody and we're developing an idea? Would that make me feel as connected as it would if I produced something, whether it's visual or otherwise, as part of a team and we have a specific audience in mind? I think that is interesting to me, that we might feel different about the work we do as a result of the process changing, that the new technology might add a different relationship to the finished product, that adding another layer in between us and the end product, that we might even make a better product because it is, of course, incredible technology, but that being that much farther away from the end user might make us feel disconnected from the work we do, or just less less full and fulfilled. That idea of loneliness being not just am I around people, I'm working with people, but in what way is my effort being felt and received?
Yeah. Do you remember? Did you watch Arrival? Do you remember that movie, Arrival?
I think so. I have to confess this: a lot of the science fiction alien contact movies start to blend into that. Is that the one where they're trying to communicate with the
squid?
The squid thing on the other side of that membrane.
The reason why I bring it up is because what I got out of that movie was, like communication and learning another way to communicate. It actually changes you and how you interact. So these new technologies will change us, right? Like we're thinking we're to communicate to change it or to bridge something, but it actually ultimately changes us and reveals maybe, things to us that we wouldn't know, right? So it's hard to predict, but will it bring us closer?
Yeah.
I don't know, right? Like it will in some ways and it won't in other ways, right? But what we want, I think what I crave at least, is genuine, real substance, like the sterile, bleak kind of landscape that we're kind of heading to with everything.
Yeah.
It's voided of life, right? And like with everything, it's quite tumultuous. Right now with like everything going on in the world and like the worry of that, it's hard to be. I guess I think of it as an artist, right? Like you want color, right?
Yeah.
You want it to be vibrant. You want experiences. Sometimes learning in the open is messy.
Yep.
Sometimes it is what it is, but we're humans and we should rejoice in some of that, right? So maybe I'm naive in that regard, but I think I need to be a little bit, right?
I think you're right. I think you have to be a little naive. I think you have to be a little bit hopeful. And I think that you've really put your finger on something insightful when you identify the back and forth nature of technological tools and technological changes and the humans who use them, that we will use them in these tools in new ways to produce new products and that will also be changed by virtue of how they affect our day-to-day lives and the way that we do our work, but that goes back and forth, bouncing off each other, and that we can steer that process and we can look to add the color that we want. That's, I think, a hopeful and encouraging place to wrap up, because there's the potential to, from a communications perspective, to feel worried or cynical that this set of technologies that we're talking about, artificial intelligence in particular, perhaps, as being something that might replace these fundamentally human impulses and traditions of communicating through the written word and expressing ideas in this way. But you've encouraged me to be more open to the potential that the change is constant and change is inevitable, and not necessarily always in the black and white binary of good change, bad change, but in the much more sort of vibrant palette of colors, and so I'm going to be more open as a result of this conversation, I think, to ChatGPT. I'm gonna go home today and tell ChatGPT that I'm sorry for saying mean things about it, and that I resolve to be more of a partner with it in the future. Alan, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been a really fabulous conversation. You've shared so many interesting ideas about how you use these communication skills in your professional life, and you've been so generous with sharing elements of your life and your journey. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, John. It's been a pleasure, honestly. Adding back to what I was saying about the pillars to the temple thing, to me, conversations in my church, right? So it's a way to calibrate, and get other people's opinions and thought processes. I think I always come from a place of we're all figuring it out still. Right now we're in a place where everyone's made up their minds. You're in this camp, that camp, and so on. I'd rather come from a place of, being open and understanding and calibrating constantly, right? And being optimistic for sure. There's definitely the worries are there, right? Definitely. But, I think yeah, I think spending the time chatting with you has been great. I'm really excited for you and what you do with the podcast, and look forward to listening and tuning in. And
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care. And that marks the end of another episode of Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast hosted by me, John Witzman, on behalf of the Communications Department and School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Conestoga College. You can find other episodes of this series on our YouTube channel, Reading and Writing Between the Lines. Stay tuned for more episodes. Thanks for listening.